Every valley keeps a story its officials refuse to write down, dismissing whispers as superstition. But the people who live beneath these ridges know better. This isn't history, it's a warning. Welcome back to history they never meant for you to hear. In these mountains, memory is a dangerous thing. The ridges of Appalachia are older than bones, older than the towns that cling to them, older than the stories that flicker and die like lanterns in the wind. And yet, there are some tales the mountain refuses to bury. Tales of a woman named Margaret, and the secret she carried into the hollows. You won't find her name carved into courthouse stone, nor in the tidy genealogies kept by the families who claim clean roots here. But in every cabin along the back roads, in every low-voiced prayer whispered at night, her story lingers like a shadow pressed too deep to fade. Officials dismiss it as superstition, a nuisance, they say, a distraction from real work. When asked about missing records, missing children, missing pages torn from ledgers, they shake their heads and point to poverty, disease, migration. Simple answers for simple folk. But the families who live under these ridgelines know better. They know Margaret's name tastes bitter when spoken aloud, that her story carries weight, and that the silence surrounding it is not ignorance, it is fear. For them, Margaret is not history. She is inheritance, and inheritance does not let go. So let me be clear with you before we begin. This is not the kind of story you tell around a campfire and forget by morning. This is not folklore that crumbles under daylight. What you are about to hear is both record and rumor, testimony and warning. It has been passed down through scorched journals, through half-burned letters, through the lips of people who swore never to speak again yet could not carry the burden alone. And if you've stayed this long, then you already know, you are not here for comfort. You are here to look at what most turn away from. Margaret's tale is rooted in a valley that looks like any other, a scattering of cabins, a church without a steeple, a creek that runs red in spring floods. But beneath the soil, beneath the stone, lies something families refuse to name. The sheriff who once sealed her house called it nonsense. The pastor who covered the parish mirrors called it temptation. Mothers who wake at night, listening for footsteps that should not be in their hallways, call it Margaret's curse. But whether curse, nonsense, or temptation, the result is the same. The mountain has never been free of her. Remember this as we go forward. The Appalachian woods are not silent. They listen, they echo, and sometimes, when the air is too still and the hollows too dark, they whisper back. Margaret's secret has waited more than a century for someone brave enough to follow the echoes. Tonight, that someone is you. This isn't just a story, it's a warning. The ridgelines are still moving. The question is, are you prepared to hear what they carry? There is only one photograph of Margaret Hale that survives, and even that feels like it was never meant to last. The print is cracked, its corners frayed, but her image is still sharp in a way that unsettles the eye. She stands on the porch of a weathered log cabin, skirt heavy with Appalachian dust, hands folded neatly at her waist. The world around her looks worn, shingles curling, railing half-rotted, but Margaret herself appears untouched. Her posture is too straight, her gaze too direct. Most photographs from that era caught people in awkward stiffness, eyes blurred or expressions lost to the slow shudder, but not Margaret. Her eyes are bright, almost glowing, and the longer you look, the less you feel you are looking at her, and the more you feel she is looking at you. Locals say the photograph was taken in the winter of 1869, a year after Margaret returned to Black Laurel Gap. She had been gone for months, some say years, nobody agreed where. Some whispered she had gone east to Charleston. Others swore they saw her boarding a riverboat southbound. But what everyone remembered clearly was what she brought back, a trunk. Heavy, iron-banded, hauled on a mule cart that groaned under its weight. No one saw her open it. No one ever knew what was inside. It sat in her cabin like an extra presence, something she dusted, something she polished, but something she never touched when others were near. Children dared each other to peek through her windows, hoping to catch her lifting the lid, but they came away only with chills and stories of hearing low humming from inside the cabin, like voices pressed against wood. The elders told it differently. They said Margaret had not brought the trunk home, they said the trunk had brought her. That when she returned, she was changed, her voice softer, her movements slower, her eyes sharper. She walked through the valley like a stranger, even among kin who had known her since childhood. Neighbors offered to help her settle back in, but she refused every kindness. "It is my burden," she told them, and those words never sat right. By spring, strange things were already stirring around Black Laurel Gap. Families began to whisper about children seen walking the ridge at dusk, pale and barefoot, heading in the direction of Margaret's cabin. Some swore the children weren't from any household they recognized. Others said they looked eerily familiar, as if faces from old memories had stepped out of time itself. When asked, Margaret said little, only that she offered shelter where the Lord commanded. But her photograph tells another story. That porch, that trunk just inside the shadows, and those eyes too composed. Looking at it now, you begin to wonder if the photograph captured Margaret or if it captured what had already begun to inhabit her. The story of Margaret's trunk is the story no one has ever managed to untangle, no matter how many dusty records they turn over. What is certain is that the object did not begin its life in Black Laurel Gap. It came from elsewhere, carried across states and through hands that tried to forget it the moment it left their possession. What it contained, no one agreed upon, and perhaps that is the most telling part. The county ledgers hold contradictions like fractured mirrors. In one, the entry is simple: trunk contents, sewing notions. On another, written in the same clerk's hand but weeks later, the description shifts: glasswork, fragile. To anyone else, such discrepancies might have been chalked up to laziness or error, but those who know the mountains insist mistakes of that kind don't survive in official books. Someone wanted the record blurred. Its journey was mapped, though imperfectly. First listed in Charleston, stamped with a shipping code so faint it is nearly illegible. Next, a transfer in Knoxville, noted by a railway agent who added a line of caution: handle with care, not to be dropped. After that, the trail vanishes from the great steel arteries of the trains and narrows into mule paths winding through the Appalachians. By the time it arrived in Black Laurel Gap, the trunk had traveled more than most families ever dreamed of, and yet the sender's name had been carefully obliterated on every surviving paper. In each ledger, the space is blacked out, smeared with ink so deliberate it bled through the page beneath. Whoever sent it never meant to be remembered. Neighbors recalled the day of its arrival. The mule cart labored up the slope, the animal frothing at the bit, eyes rolling as though it sensed the unnatural weight it carried. Margaret stood waiting on her porch, still as stone, offering no word of thanks to the driver. She motioned to the corner of her cabin, and there the trunk was set down, its iron bands gleaming despite the mountain's damp air. From that moment forward, it never moved again. Some said it gave off a faint hum, like wind against glass, even in still weather. Others claimed they saw condensation bead along its surface, as though it sweated from within. The bravest children whispered that if you pressed your ear to its lid, you could hear a faint tapping from the inside, like fingernails on wood. Whether those stories were inventions of frightened minds or something truer, no one could say, because Margaret never opened it. Not once. It sat like a second hearth in her cabin, commanding presence without flame. The strangest part, though, was how quickly people around her began to avoid speaking of it, as if silence itself was part of the bargain. Records blurred, memories contradicted, and soon the trunk was no longer just an object. It was a question that no one dared ask aloud. Where had it come from, and what had Margaret agreed to carry up into the mountains with her? The mountain people say it began quietly, almost mercifully, as if the valley itself was testing how much strangeness the town was willing to ignore. After storms, when creeks overflowed and barns buckled, children appeared at Margaret Hale's door. No one ever saw them arrive. They were simply there, standing barefoot on her porch as though the floodwaters had carried them out of the earth. At funerals, it happened again. Families laid their dead in the ground and returned home to find a pale child lingering at the edge of the service, waiting for Margaret to beckon them closer. She always did. She never explained. What unsettled the valley most wasn't just that these children arrived without warning, but that they didn't belong to anyone. Parish records carried no births, no baptisms, no parents stepping forward to claim them. School rolls never listed their names, and yet neighbors swore they glimpsed the little ones trailing behind Margaret as she walked the ridge paths at dusk. The preacher tried to excuse it as charity, saying Margaret had taken in strays, orphans overlooked by the system. But the people here knew every family, every name. These children weren't lost, they were unknown. Their clothing drew whispers. Homespun shirts sat beside garments stitched from fabrics no one in Black Laurel Gap could afford. A girl wore shoes cut from leather finer than any local tanner could produce, while a boy stood in trousers patched from rough burlap, the kind usually used for feed sacks. They carried no belongings, no keepsakes. It was as though they had stepped directly out of another place and into Margaret's keeping. Even their speech betrayed them. At first, some had lilting accents, rhythms that hinted at Charleston or Kingston, or even lands further away. But within a week, their voices flattened, falling into the same quiet cadence, the same measured pauses. It was as if the mountain swallowed their origins whole and returned them as one. The final detail, the one that lodged deepest in the memory of anyone who caught a glimpse, was their eyes. Children's eyes are supposed to scatter with curiosity, bright and unfixed. These eyes did not wander. They reflected lantern light in a way that unsettled the stomach, like wet stone glistening in a cave. More than one farmer swore that when the children turned toward him at night, their eyes seemed to hold the flame rather than mirror it, tiny furnaces watching from faces too still. Margaret offered no explanations. When pressed, she only said she had opened her door and the children had stepped through. To outsiders, it might sound like kindness. To those who lived beneath the ridgelines, it sounded like a warning. The mountains are full of orphans, but these were something else entirely. They were children who didn't belong to anyone, and yet in Margaret's care, they seemed to belong to something. For all the whispers that clung to Margaret Hale's cabin, none were heavier than those about the room she painted blue. In an age when mountain homes wore bare log walls or, at most, a wash of white, Margaret chose a color that seemed foreign to the valley. Neighbors who glimpsed it through a crack in the shutters called it sky blue, though some swore it was too vivid, almost shimmering like river water at noon. The door to that room was always locked. No child from the hollow was ever invited inside, and even those Margaret took into her care were kept from crossing its threshold. People said the key never left the chain around her neck. It was only by chance that anyone outside saw what waited within. A midwife, summoned when Margaret fell ill one spring, was briefly admitted to the house. Margaret directed her toward the hearthroom, but as the woman moved through the narrow hallway, she found the blue door slightly ajar. She pushed it open with the gentlest touch, and later said the sight stayed with her until her dying day. The space inside was immaculate, far too neat for a mountain cabin filled with children. Small wooden beds lined the walls, all covered with quilts folded so tight the corners could cut. Toys rested on a low shelf, dolls, blocks, a spinning top, but each looked untouched, as if polished for display rather than worn by little hands. What struck her most, though, were the mirrors. They weren't hung like decoration. They were arranged with purpose, each tilted inward toward a single bare patch of floor in the center of the room. The glass was mottled, some cracked, others fogged with age, yet every one of them leaned to capture the same circle of space. Standing there, the midwife said she felt her own reflection crowd around her, dozens of faces she did not recognize staring back in silence. Her knees trembled, and she left before Margaret noticed her hesitation. She told no one for years, fearing mockery, until age loosened her tongue and memory blurred her caution. The neighbors who heard her story nodded in grim recognition, as if it confirmed suspicions they already carried. They had long believed the blue room was not meant for living but for waiting. Waiting for something to step into that circle, to be multiplied endlessly in the angled glass. A room painted the color of sky, locked against the world, filled with beds never slept in and toys never played with. Margaret called it a children's room. The people of Black Laurel Gap called it something else entirely. A chamber of reflection. A stage set for something that had not yet arrived. The story of the hymn without words has been told and retold so many times in Black Laurel Gap that no one can remember when it first began to circulate. Some say it was the winter of 1872, when snow pressed heavy on the roofs and every sound carried sharp across the hollow. Others insist it was later, when the cabin already had more children than anyone could count. But all agree on one detail. It was the milk runner who heard it first. He was a boy then, no older than 16, tasked with delivering jars up and down the ridge before dawn. His mule clopped slowly through the frost, breath steaming in the lantern light. As he approached Margaret Hale's cabin, the night air shifted. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't the cry of owls. It was a sound too human to dismiss, too strange to forget. From within the cabin came a chorus of voices, high and low, rising together not in song but in a humming so precise it knotted the stomach. There were no lyrics, no words to soften the edges, only breath and pitch woven into perfect unison. The runner reined in his mule, straining to hear. At first he thought it must be a hymn, children rehearsing some church piece for Sunday service. But the longer he listened, the more wrong it felt. There was no leader's voice, no mother or preacher to guide the rhythm. The sound was self-contained, a circle with no beginning. The humming grew louder, swelling and thinning, until he thought the walls themselves might split from the pressure of it. He described it later as the drone of bees caught in glass, each note vibrating against his teeth. When Margaret finally appeared at the door, her lamp held steady, she greeted him with her usual composure. He stammered, asking about the voices, about the strange chorus he'd heard. She smiled, almost indulgently, and said the children were practicing call and response. But the boy noticed there had been no call, only the answer. Repeated and repeated until it no longer sounded like children at all. The milk runner left shaken, and though he finished his route, he refused to deliver to Margaret's cabin again. He told the story for the rest of his life, his voice dropping when he recalled the moment the humming stopped. It ended not like a song fading, but like a breath being cut off all at once, silence slamming into the air so suddenly he thought he had gone deaf. Others in the valley began to admit they too had heard it drifting across the fields, especially on still nights when the moon was thin. They called it the hymn without words, though most preferred never to speak of it at all, for in the hollow, silence was safer than remembering the sound of children answering a caller no one ever heard. When investigators first stepped inside Margaret Hale's cabin decades after her death, they expected dust and decay, the ordinary rot of time. What they found instead was a silence so heavy it pressed against their ribs, as though the house itself had been holding its breath. It was in that silence that they began to notice the marks, faint at first, then overwhelming, until it seemed every surface carried the memory of something trying to get out. Beneath the window lath, hidden in the thin spaces where wood met plaster, were crescents carved deep enough to splinter the frame. They were not the careless scrapes of furniture or tools. These were arcs of human fingernails, gouged in desperation, layered one atop another. Some stopped mid-scratch, as if the hand had been yanked away before finishing. When lamplight angled just right, the gouges seemed fresh, their edges sharp, their story unfinished. Lower down the walls, at the height of a kneeling child, knife-scribed symbols ran in uneven rows. Circles intersected by jagged lines, triangles etched again and again until the plaster broke loose in chalky flakes. No one could decipher them, though a few resembled characters found in old hymnals, notes cut into shapes too angular to sing. The pattern was deliberate, repeated, a language formed not for communication but for insistence. Whoever made them needed to be remembered. Most chilling were the tally marks. At first glance, they looked like ordinary counts scratched by restless children, lines grouped in fives, sets clustered neatly across the plaster. But when added together, each series ended abruptly at the number 23, only to begin again at 1. The pattern repeated throughout the cabin, in bedrooms, along the baseboards, even hidden behind the hearthstones. 23, then 1. Always the same. Historians argued it must be the age of a lost child, or the number of orphans Margaret had taken in, but the truth felt less like arithmetic and more like ritual. Years later, during an excavation of the burial ground near the Hale property, a coroner documented something that still unsettles archivists. Among the scattered remains, a single femur bore numbers etched directly into the bone, not carved by knives, but scored in grooves that matched human fingernail width. The numbers were small, crude, yet unmistakable. 23 strokes, then 1. The coroner's note in the margin was brief, underlined twice. Impossible. He refused to elaborate further, and the bone itself vanished into storage, never catalogued, never displayed. The scratches, the symbols, the impossible tallying were not remnants of play or idle hands. They were testimony carved in wood, plaster, and bone, insisting on a pattern that refused to die with Margaret Hale's generation. Every mark whispered the same unfinished sentence, as though someone or something was keeping count. And in the hollows of Appalachia, people began to wonder, what happens when the count is complete? The hollow below Margaret Hale's cabin has always carried an uneasy reputation, a place where even the most seasoned hunters hesitate to linger after dusk. By the 1930s, long after her death, the valley was nearly abandoned, cabins caving in under vines and rain. Yet Black Laurel Hollow drew curious wanderers, hikers, folklorists, and men working under the WPA, tasked with mapping forgotten ridges and creeks. It was they who began to speak of an echo unlike any other, a sound that did not return what was given but something altered, as though the hollow itself was listening and choosing its reply. A group of hikers first reported it in the summer of 1934. They shouted for one another across the ravine, expecting the usual scatter of echoes. Instead, what came back was wrong. One man called his friend's name David, and the hollow answered with a low, drawn-out note, deeper than any voice among them. Another whistled a simple tune, but the return carried two notes at once, discordant, like children humming behind a wall. The men laughed it off at first, convinced it was a trick of wind and stone. But when they tried again, the responses grew stranger. A single word came back, not as repetition but as question, syllables stretched, twisted, as though the echo had learned their sound but not their meaning. That same year, a WPA surveyor named Henry Colson set up camp in the hollow to document its geography. His field book, recovered decades later, contains a handful of neat sketches, ridge lines, water tables, soil notes. Then, the handwriting begins to shift. In one entry, he describes responsive harmonics, claiming that sounds made at precise intervals returned not delayed but immediate, as if the hollow were anticipating them. He noted that the echo seemed to grow stronger after dusk, and that once, when he coughed, the sound that came back was laughter. The final page of his journal trails off mid-sentence. The words smear into mud stains, as though written in haste while the rain came down, or while hands trembled too hard to hold the pencil steady. His last legible phrase reads, "Voices not mine." Nothing more. His camp was found abandoned, his supplies scattered, but Henry himself was never located. The people of the mountains call it the echo that answers back. They say the hollow has kept something it should never have been given, and now it practices with whatever voices fall into its reach. On still nights, when owls fall silent and even the creek holds its breath, travelers swear they hear the hollow humming, testing notes, waiting for someone to call out again. Few are brave enough to try. Those who do never raise their voice more than once. The people of Black Laurel Gap still whisper about the boy who came twice. His name was Josiah Pike, a farmhand's son born in the lean years after the war, known for his quiet disposition and the way he kept to the ridge roads long after the sun had dropped. He was neither remarkable nor troublesome, just another child of the mountain until the evening he met himself. It was said to be dusk when it happened, the kind of fading light that turns the ridges into silhouettes and makes every shadow seem like an intruder. Josiah was walking home from his uncle's mill when he stopped dead in his tracks. Coming toward him along the narrow road was a boy of the same height, the same build, wearing the same patched shirt and scuffed boots. At first, Josiah thought it was his reflection cast strangely in the fading light, but the figure drew closer, step for step, until there was no mistaking it. He was staring into his own face. Neighbors who heard the story from Josiah's lips recalled how his voice shook when he tried to describe it. The other Josiah looked calm, almost expectant, as if he had been waiting for this encounter. Neither spoke. They simply stood in silence on the ridge road, the air between them thick with something that felt too old to be fear. After a moment, the second Josiah turned and walked back the way he had come, vanishing into the tree line, as though the forest had swallowed him whole. 2 weeks later, tragedy struck. Josiah Pike was found dead near the creek, his body bruised in ways that suggested no accident. The family insisted on a closed casket, warning neighbors not to ask questions. Rumors spread that the boy's face had been disfigured, though no one could agree how. Some said his eyes were too wide, fixed open even in death. Others claimed his mouth was stretched in a shape no human should wear. Whatever the truth, the lid was sealed tight, and the boy was laid in the ground before the sun had risen twice more. But the story did not end there. On the morning of the funeral, witnesses swore they saw another Josiah Pike standing at the edge of the cemetery. He was dressed in the same patched shirt, the same scuffed boots, yet his hair looked slightly darker, his frame slightly older. He said nothing. He only placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the mound of fresh earth and walked away down the ridge road. None of the mourners followed, and none ever saw him again. The tale has lingered like a wound in the town's memory. Was Josiah replaced by his double, or did the mountains demand two versions of the same boy, one for the grave and one for the road? No one can say. But those who live near Black Laurel still warn their children never to walk the ridge at dusk, lest they meet themselves coming the other way. The schoolhouse that once stood at the edge of Black Laurel Gap was a simple, one-room structure, its walls of pine darkened by smoke and years of chalk dust. Most of what was kept there, slates, ink bottles, scraps of primer, vanished when the building collapsed in the 1920s. But one artifact survived, a ledger so ordinary in appearance that no one expected it to carry such weight. Its leather cover was cracked, its pages brittle, yet the names inside were written with careful consistency. Every student enrolled in the Hollow from the late 1800s to the turn of the century. Except for three. Those three names never changed. Year after year, as children came and went, as families moved deeper into the mountains or left for mill towns, the same entries appeared in the same hand. The teacher wrote them neatly, almost reverently, as though copying something dictated rather than filling out attendance. What unnerved researchers decades later were the margins. Small sketches accompanied the three names, faces of children drawn with rough pencil strokes. Each year the doodles looked the same. The hair was parted the same way, the eyes dark and round, the mouths set in straight, unsmiling lines. Unlike the other children, whose portraits shifted as they grew taller or older, these three never aged. Oral tradition remembers the teacher, Miss Clara Morton, as a woman of rigid faith and dutiful record-keeping. Neighbors insisted she never invented or exaggerated. Yet no one in the valley could recall three children matching those names. No baptisms, no graves, no family ties. When asked, Miss Morton would only press her lips tight and say, "They are present, and that is enough." The phrase lingered long after her death, a statement that seemed less like reassurance and more like warning. When the county consolidated its districts in 1908, the old school's records were packed into crates and sent to storage. Most of those boxes decayed in damp basements or were discarded outright. The ledger, however, reappeared decades later in the archives of a courthouse. The pages were warped by water, the ink smeared into blots, as though it had been submerged, all except for the entries of those same 3 children. Their names stood out clear, their penciled faces untouched by water damage, crisp as the day they were drawn. Archivists who handled the book admitted privately that the rest of the paper felt soft and fragile, but those particular pages were stiff, resistant, almost as though they had been preserved by something more deliberate than chance. The ledger is rarely shown now, kept in a drawer that clerks do not volunteer to open. Those who have seen it say the faces seem sharper each time, the eyes a little darker, the mouths a little closer to speaking. No one can explain why the records of a long-forgotten schoolhouse refuse to fade. Some believe the children were Margaret Hale's, tethered to the hollow by ink and habit. Others fear they still sit in some hidden classroom, waiting for their names to be called again. By 1901, the stories around Margaret Hale's cabin had grown too loud to ignore. Families whispered of children who appeared and vanished, of voices humming in the night, of windows covered hastily after dusk. When a boy from a neighboring farm disappeared on his way home, the townspeople pressed the authorities for action. Sheriff Elias Lawson, a man known for his stern practicality, finally agreed to lead an inquiry. He chose 2 deputies to accompany him, along with Reverend Cole, the local preacher. Together, they walked the narrow path to Margaret's cabin on an autumn morning, their boots crunching frost while the valley held its breath. Witnesses later recalled that the men entered with a kind of practiced bravado, but when they emerged, something in them had changed. Sheriff Lawson carried his hat in his hand, his face pale as chalk. The preacher muttered prayers under his breath, his voice shaking. Neither deputy spoke a word. Without addressing the gathered crowd, Lawson pulled a length of chain from his satchel and wrapped it across the cabin door. He nailed a board across the frame, marking the house closed. To the people demanding answers, he offered only one explanation. The cabin was unsafe, a structural risk, he called it, prone to collapse. But those who stood close enough saw his hands tremble as he hammered the nails. The official report, filed neatly in county records, repeated the same excuse. The beams were rotting, the floors unstable, the place too dangerous for further use. No mention of children. No mention of Margaret's legacy, but years later, a private letter surfaced, written in Lawson's own hand to his brother in Knoxville. In it, he confessed something he never dared put in public ink. "I will not set foot in that house again. I went to look, and it looked back." He never described what "it" was, only that the preacher insisted they pray over the threshold before leaving, and one deputy swore he heard movement in the locked blue room, though the door had never been opened. The sheriff's letter ends with a single unsettling line. "I fear we sealed nothing in. I fear we sealed ourselves out." From that day forward, Lawson avoided the hollow. He retired early, leaving law enforcement behind, and refused to speak of the inquiry. The cabin stood chained and silent, its windows dark, but neighbors said they still heard faint humming when the wind pressed against the boards. To the county, the matter was settled, a problem hidden beneath the tidy excuse of structural risk. To the valley, however, it became proof of something far worse. Even the law had looked inside, and the law had turned away. The summer of 1924 was dry, the kind of season when the air itself seemed brittle and one careless spark could set a ridge alight. That year, a brush fire crept down from the higher slopes and licked dangerously close to the ruins of Margaret Hale's cabin. Neighbors managed to beat back the flames with shovels and wet burlap, but not before the fire had scorched the earth behind the house. When the smoke cleared, it revealed something no one expected. Beneath the ash lay a shallow pit, and in that pit glittered a scatter of cobalt glass shards, gleaming against the blackened soil like frozen water catching the sun. At first, those who found the fragments assumed they were remnants of bottles, but the more they sifted, the stranger the discovery became. The shards were not curved as bottles should be, nor thick as window panes. They were thin, silvered on one side, some flaking with age, others sharp enough to slice through cloth. The pit held hundreds of them, layered as though someone had been discarding broken pieces over years, piling them deeper and deeper, until fire stripped away the cover of soil. Word spread, and soon a geologist from the state university arrived to inspect the find. He crouched in the dirt, turning the pieces over in his hands, and declared them mirror backings. The cobalt tint, he explained, came from chemicals used to treat reflective glass in the mid-19th century. Whoever lived here, he suggested, must have had an unusual number of mirrors, breaking and burying them one after another. He made notes in his journal, eager to publish the peculiarity. But before he could return for further study, neighbors made it clear his presence was no longer welcome. A few weeks later, a folklorist from Kentucky heard whispers of the pit and came to see for herself. Unlike the geologist, she did not treat the shards as curiosities of craftsmanship. She listened to the locals, to the stories of humming nights and locked blue rooms, and she offered a different interpretation. The mirrors, she said, were not discarded, they were bait. Tools to draw something closer, to hold its attention, to multiply its image until it could be fed. The words unsettled the farmers who had shown her the pit, and they quickly sent her away, insisting she never return. Today, the fragments are gone. Some say they were gathered and buried deeper, sealed away where no fire could expose them again. Others claim they were ground into dust and scattered into the creek. But those who were there on that scorched morning swear the shards caught more than sunlight. They insist that when the wind moved across them, the pieces gave off not just a glimmer, but a faint hum, like a hymn without words, echoing from the ground itself. In 1974, a small mountain church in Black Laurel Gap held a prayer circle for what the congregation called the missing. The service was simple, a gathering of mothers and fathers who had lost children without explanation, along with neighbors who feared the same fate might one day visit their homes. Someone had brought an old reel-to-reel recorder, the kind usually used to capture sermons or choir practice. They set it on a folding chair in the corner, pressed the red button, and left it running through the night. No one gave it much thought afterward. The prayers were quiet, the hymns unremarkable, and when the group dispersed, the tape was rewound, boxed, and stored in the basement beneath the church. It sat there for years, forgotten under stacks of hymnals and rotting cardboard. When the church was renovated in the early 1990s, volunteers stumbled upon the reels. Most were ordinary sermons, scratchy choir rehearsals, a preacher's booming voice half lost in static. But one reel was different. When played forward, the tape carried nothing but a wall of white noise. Not silence, not emptiness, but the steady hiss of air, like a storm trapped in the spool. At first, the archivist assumed the tape had degraded. Then, almost by accident, he reversed the playback. That was when the voices emerged. They were soft, childlike, layered in fragile unison. At first it was only a hum, the same droning pitch that neighbors once described coming from Margaret Hale's cabin nearly a century earlier. Then the humming shifted into rhythm. The voices began counting. 1, 2, 3, the syllables faint but clear enough to send chills down the spine. The numbers climbed slowly, almost reluctantly, until they reached 23. There, the counting paused. For a moment, the tape carried only breath, the sound of lungs straining just beyond the speakers. Then, faint and unmistakable, came laughter. Not the laughter of joy, but a rasping, breathless sound, as though someone exhaled mirth without ever smiling. The laughter faded, and the reel clicked empty. No explanation was ever offered. Technicians tested the machine and the reel itself, insisting there was no mechanical fault. Some believed it was a prank inserted during recording, but parishioners who had attended the prayer circle swore the night had been solemn, free of disruption. They remembered the room heavy with grief, no children present at all. Yet the tape preserved their absence as presence, voices without bodies, laughter without joy. To this day, the reel remains locked away, seldom played. Those who have heard it say the counting lingers in the mind long after the tape ends, and the pause at 23 feels like an invitation, a threshold. No one knows what would follow if the voices ever decided to count further. By the time county census takers came through Black Laurel Gap at the turn of the century, most households were accustomed to the routine. A knock on the door, questions about land, livestock, children. Names written in neat script that tied families to generations before them. But in at least 4 homes along the hollow, the records show something far stranger, details that never should have been overlooked. These were families with cribs tucked in corners, with toys scattered on porches, with lullabies heard by neighbors through open windows, and yet, no recorded births, no listed children. One farmhouse in particular drew attention years later when researchers compared census books. The home had been photographed by a WPA worker in the 1930s, and in the background of the image, a small rocking horse can be seen in the yard. But in every census entry, the couple who lived there insisted they were childless. When asked directly, the wife responded flatly, "We never had a baby." The words were repeated in other households, always the same phrasing, as if rehearsed. What made the anomalies impossible to dismiss were the physical traces. Mattresses with the deep indentation of a child's weight, worn slippers lined up neatly at the edge of a bed, quilts stitched in patterns meant for infants. Neighbors remembered the sound of crying in the night, the fleeting glimpse of little figures in doorways. But when the census takers returned each decade, the children were absent not only from the records but from memory itself. The families spoke as though they had never existed. Decades later, in the 1970s, an oral history project sent graduate students into the mountains to interview surviving elders. One of those tapes, long forgotten in a university archive, preserves the voice of a grandmother from Black Laurel. Her interviewer asked about raising children in the valley. There is a pause, a shuffle, then her voice drops into a whisper. "I remember the lullaby," she says, "but not the name." She repeats it, more distressed the second time. "I remember the lullaby, not the name." The tape ends abruptly, as though someone in the room stopped the recorder. To this day, archivists cannot explain why entire families would deny their own children, or how memory could erase what the body and the house so clearly bore witness to. In Black Laurel Gap, the explanation whispered from porch to porch is far simpler, though far more terrifying. The children never belonged to the families at all. They belonged to Margaret, to the hollow, to something that left cribs full but minds empty, rocking horses moving in yards where no one remembers who once played there. Researchers who dared to piece together the fragments of Margaret Hale's story noticed something strange when they laid the records side by side. Disappearances, humming nights, and reports of pale children were scattered across decades. Yet when charted on a map, the chaos began to take form. The incidents did not occur randomly, but along the ridges in a pattern too precise to ignore. From above, the sites formed a 7-point star, each tip marked by its own tale of unease. The house where toys remained but no children were remembered. The hollow that returned echoes in the wrong voice. The pit of cobalt glass shards that glinted like ice even in summer. Every line stretched inward, and at the center of it all stood the ruins of Margaret's cabin. Today, nothing remains of the structure except the base of the chimney, a heap of stone long surrendered to moss. And yet the ground there refuses to behave like the rest of the mountain. Even in the warmth of June, a frost line circles the chimney base, thin but unyielding, a crust of ice that never fully melts. Farmers who wander too close say the soil crunches underfoot as if winter hides beneath a shallow skin of earth. No one dares break the frost with a spade. Those who tried claimed their tools rang like metal striking glass. In 2018, a team of graduate students from a nearby university carried a drone into Black Laurel Gap to test thermal imaging equipment. Flying over the ridge, they captured swaths of forest and shale glowing with predictable heat signatures. But when the drone passed over the chimney site, the images shifted. Beneath the frost line, the screen displayed pockets of heat radiating in irregular shapes, clustered as though something alive was moving below bare rock. The signatures were faint but undeniable. Too warm to be explained by buried stone, too distinct to be dismissed as animal dens. One technician described them as figures, though he quickly retracted the word. The footage was never released officially. The university labeled it inconclusive, blaming calibration errors. But a copy circulated quietly, passed from hand to hand in the valley. Those who have seen it swear the shapes are not random at all but arranged in a circle, shifting slowly, like children gathering for a hymn. The people of Black Laurel do not need thermal scans to tell them what the ground already knows. They see the star traced across their ridges, they feel the air tighten around the chimney base, and they know Margaret's secret was never buried in her cabin alone. The mountain itself has been keeping the pattern, waiting, preserving it in frost and fire alike. And now that the shape has been revealed, the question lingers like smoke in the hollow air: what happens when the star completes itself? By the 1950s, most stories tied to Black Laurel Hollow belonged to the night. Strange humming after sundown, windows that reflected too much, and whispers of children moving where no children should be. But then came the daylight sightings, accounts that left even hardened hunters uneasy. These were not tricks of lantern light or shadows stretched across moonlit ridges. They happened under the clear sun, in the open woods, where men trusted their eyes most. The first report came from a pair of brothers stalking deer through a laurel thicket. They swore they saw two small figures crouched among the branches, pale and motionless, their faces half hidden by leaves. At first, the hunters thought them to be lost children. But when one figure turned its head, the other mirrored the motion at the exact same instant, as if both necks had been pulled by the same string. The brothers froze, too startled to raise their rifles. Then one of the children lifted a hand slowly, palm outward in a gesture that might have been greeting or warning. Only it wasn't the child who moved first. It was the reflection of the gesture, a split second ahead, as though a mirror had commanded the body rather than copied it. The men backed away, whispering prayers under their breath, but curiosity overcame fear long enough to follow the figure's trail. In the soft earth of the laurel grove, the footprints began in a single-file line, one step neatly before the other, too precise for children wandering. Then, as the tracks reached the clearing, they split suddenly into two sets, side by side, pressed deep as though weighted. The hunters followed until the prints simply stopped. Not scattered, not faded, vanished. One step existed, the next did not, as if the earth had refused to record where the children had gone. Similar sightings trickled in over the years. A farmer swore he saw them watching from the edge of his pasture, heads tilting in unison as he drove his cattle. A mail carrier caught them staring from behind a fence post, their mouths moving in perfect rhythm though no sound carried across the road. Always two, always synchronized, and always vanishing before anyone could get too close. Skeptics called them hallucinations, tricks of sunlight on the leaves. But the men who saw them during the day did not doubt their eyes. They were seasoned woodsmen, used to tracking game, reading sign, distinguishing illusion from truth. What shook them wasn't just the figures themselves but the unnatural order of their movements, as if one body did not breathe without the other echoing it. To see such a thing in daylight was worse than hearing hymns at midnight. It stripped away the safety of the sun and left the mountain bare, a place where Margaret's children still walked, not as ghosts but as patterns etched into the earth itself. In every county there are keepers of paper, quiet figures who decide which stories survive and which fade into dust. In Black Laurel, that role fell for many years to Ruth Mallory, an archivist who understood that history often hides in the margins. By the late 1950s, she had grown used to handling land deeds, tax rolls, and yellowed photographs no one else cared to touch. But when she began assembling the collection that came to be known only as the Hale box, her work took on a different weight. The contents were simple enough on the surface: a faded photograph of Margaret Hale on her porch, the one where her eyes shine too brightly for the era's slow exposure. Sheriff Lawson's private letter confessing that something inside the cabin looked back, and the peculiar ledger pages from the old schoolhouse, where the same three children appeared year after year, never aging. Alongside these, she placed a small craft envelope filled with cobalt glass shards, their edges dulled by time. Across the envelope's flap, she wrote in her neat hand, "Keep out of sun." Colleagues later remembered how Ruth treated the Hale materials differently than any other file. She did not leave the box on open shelves but kept it tucked beneath her desk, away from the regular rhythm of courthouse requests. When pressed on why she hadn't cataloged it properly, she would only shake her head and say, "It's not meant to be filed, it's meant to be remembered." Few argued with her. There was something about her tone that discouraged further questions. Over the years, visitors noted small oddities around Ruth's office. A low hum seemed to rise whenever the box was placed on her desk, faint but persistent. Once, during a summer afternoon, a clerk swore the photograph of Margaret shifted slightly, the woman's gaze no longer straight at the camera, but angled toward the clerk himself. Ruth dismissed the claim, but afterward she stopped letting others handle the contents. When Ruth Mallory died in 1972, her papers were inventoried, her belongings boxed. Among them, staff found the Hale collection sealed in a wooden crate, tied with string. On the lid was a note in an unfamiliar hand. At family request, do not open. The oddest part was that Ruth had no surviving family. No relatives came forward, no executor made such a request. Yet, the courthouse clerks obeyed the instruction without hesitation. The box was placed in storage, its accession number deliberately skipped in the record books. Today, the crate still sits in a back room, unlisted, invisible to researchers combing through county indexes. No one claims to know who wrote the note or why staff chose to honor it. But every so often, a new hire stumbles across the crate, its string intact, its contents humming faintly in the quiet. And like those before them, they put it back in the dark, unwilling to be the one who dares file Margaret Hale's history into the light. The old clapboard church in Black Laurel Gap had seen many strange winters, but none lingered in memory like the Advent when every mirror disappeared beneath black gauze. The decision came from Pastor Whitlow, a man known less for theatrics than for stubborn pragmatism. He had grown weary of whispers in his congregation, children staring too long into the polished brass of the offering plates, women claiming to see unfamiliar faces in the window panes during evening service, men muttering of shadows that shifted with the hymns. When Advent began, Whitlow climbed a ladder and personally draped every reflective surface in the sanctuary. The pulpit cross, the communion chalice, even the font's silver rim vanished beneath strips of gauze. He told the parishioners it was a gesture of reverence, though his eyes betrayed a deeper concern. The effect was immediate. Parishioners described the sanctuary as strangely muted, as if the air itself had thickened. One woman remarked that her own footsteps sounded softer on the wooden floorboards, while another claimed her prayers carried no echo at all. The choir's voices blended as usual, but between verses a silence fell that felt heavier than stone. A few dared to say it seemed safer somehow, though none could explain why. Others whispered a more unsettling thought that the gauze muffled not their voices but something listening from outside, straining to answer through the glass. Through the weeks of Advent, the congregation adjusted, though unease clung to them like frost. Children were warned not to tug at the gauze, but more than one adult admitted to seeing the fabric twitch as though stirred by breath. Whitlow remained stoic, though he began ending services earlier, sending families home before dusk. Each week he replaced any gauze that slipped, his hands firm, his jaw set against questions. It was on Christmas Eve that the quiet ritual unraveled. Parishioners entered expecting the same veiled sanctuary, but instead they found the gauze gone. Every mirror and polished surface lay uncovered, gleaming with candlelight. At first, there was relief until someone noticed the gauze itself. Every strip had been folded with deliberate care and laid upon the altar in a single neat stack, corners aligned, fabric pressed flat. No one admitted to touching them. Whitlow's face turned pale as he ran a hand across the folded pile. He said nothing, only led the midnight hymn with a voice that cracked on the final note. After that winter, no one dared cover the mirrors again. Families kept the story alive only in whispers, warning that the gauze had not fallen, had not been discarded, but had been returned, folded like an offering. As if something had acknowledged the gesture, accepted it, and given the church back its reflections. The sanctuary has never sounded the same since. When the modern team arrived at the ruins of Margaret Hale's cabin, they came with cameras, measuring tools, and the steady certainty that whatever remained could be explained. The house had long since sagged into ruin, its walls leaning, its roof collapsed. Only the chimney and the faint outline of the blue room's foundation still stood. But curiosity does not leave the past alone, and so the investigators, part folklorists and part thrill-seekers, pried up the warped floorboards of the chamber that had haunted Black Laurel legend for more than a century. What they found beneath silenced even the most skeptical among them. Instead of solid earth, there was a narrow cavity, barely tall enough for kneeling. One by one they lowered themselves inside, crouching in the close air, and saw that the walls were not rough stone or soil, but unnervingly smooth. Every surface had been polished, not by tools, but by touch, as though countless small hands had brushed, pressed, and rubbed against the chamber over years until it gleamed faintly in the beam of their flashlights. The walls seemed to curve slightly inward, holding sound too tightly, making every breath echo back twice. At first, the team thought it a storage crawlspace or a failed cellar, but the evidence told a different story. The walls bore no tool marks, no nails, no shelves. There was nothing to suggest it had ever held barrels or supplies. Instead, there were faint indentations along the lower stone, lines where fingers had dragged repeatedly in the same direction. The chamber was not built to store, it was built to contain. Then came the discovery that made the team hesitate. In the dust that coated the floor, one print stood out clearly against the undisturbed surface. It was small, child-sized, but distorted, its edges flattened unnaturally. The impression did not sink downward into the dust as a footprint should. Instead, it pressed upward, as though forced against the floorboards from beneath. One of the investigators whispered that it looked mirror-flattened, the shape of a foot trying to press through glass. The team recorded everything, photographing the print from every angle. Yet when they reviewed the footage later, the images shifted. In one frame, the print was sharp. In the next, it appeared doubled, as though two overlapping feet had tried to claim the same space. One investigator swore the dust rippled faintly, though no one had touched it. They sealed the boards again before leaving, but not before noting how the air in the chamber had grown colder, how the light seemed dimmer the longer they stayed. Back at their university lab, the team filed their report, dry and clinical. Yet one line slipped through, scribbled in the margin of a field notebook. It's not that the children were in the blue room, it's that the blue room was in them, waiting for release. The story of Margaret Hale was never meant to resolve neatly, legends rarely do. What lingers in the hollows of Black Laurel is not a confession, nor a clear record, but the outline of something Margaret understood, and no one else dared admit. For generations, she has been painted as a conjurer, a thief of children, a woman who invited the unspeakable into her cabin. Yet the fragments of evidence the trunk no one could trace, The blue room built like a stage, the mirrors shattered and buried in the soil hint at a more complicated truth. Margaret did not summon. She contained. The trunk that arrived by mule train, its sender's name struck from every ledger, was not a gift. It was a burden, a responsibility pressed upon her in silence. She carried it home to Black Laurel Gap because the mountain itself, with its caves and hidden valleys, was strong enough to hold what she could not destroy. The children who appeared at her door after storms and funerals were not orphans she sought out. They were drawn to the presence she carried, folded into the same pattern she had sworn to confine. The blue room, with its mirrors tilted inward and its beds that never bore the warmth of sleep, was not meant as a nursery but as a prison, a chamber meant to bind reflection to reflection, to trap rather than nurture. Every tally mark carved into plaster, every shard of cobalt glass buried in fire pits, every hymn without words was part of the effort, not to invite the thing in, but to keep it from spreading. Neighbors mistook her silence for guilt, her secrecy for cruelty. They did not see the weight of containment, the ritual of maintenance, the endless vigilance. Margaret carried a knowledge that could not be spoken aloud. Some forces cannot be banished, only held in place, delayed long enough for others to live ordinary lives in the shadow of what she kept bound. The only surviving line in her own hand was found years later, scrawled on the back of a receipt tucked between ledger pages. The ink was faded, the script uneven, but the words were unmistakable. If you break the blue, they'll learn your names. Whether she meant the blue paint of the locked chamber, the cobalt glass shards buried behind her cabin, or the sky itself reflected in the mountain's hollow, no one can say. But those who have seen the frost around her chimney base, or heard the hollow answer back in voices not their own, believe she meant all of it. Margaret Hale was not guarding a house. She was guarding the world outside of it, and in her silence she left only one warning. The barrier is fragile, and the names it waits to learn may yet be ours.